Hey YouTube, welcome back to part 2 of the Radiator rebuild, and this is the finished product after you watched part 1. Basically what I did was I had to drill the header on the new core. It did not come with any of the holes, so I had to do that first. And the way that I did that was I actually used the tank, and I used these bars, and the header of the core is the exact same dimension as the tank. So I lined that up on there perfectly, clamped it, and used the steel as drill guides and drilled all the holes. 42 holes, I believe, on each end. So I drilled all those, and then I took it apart. And by drilling them and putting the bolts in as you go, you end up making sure there's no cumulative error, meaning this thing is not shifting down even a 32nd of an inch every time, which after 16 bolts would be a half inch. So after you drill it, you put a bolt in there. Then what I did was I disassembled it. I did not have the gasket in there when I did the drilling. I cleaned off the surface of the header where it's made out of a brass material, and so it raised some burrs as I drilled through it. So I made sure I got all the burrs off of there and that surface was perfectly flat and clean. If it was dented a little bit from handling, I got it as flat as I could get it and cleaned it off real well. Both ends are identical, basically. So then I stood it up on end. Doesn't matter which end you start with, and start to put it together. These are the side frames. This one side frame here, which is a weldment that goes to here, both ends. This side frame has the hinges on it. This is the same side frame, but it has the latch on it. That has to fit perfectly. That goes in right up against the header on the core. So you put that in there with this facing up, and then what I did was I put a small bead of this gasket maker all around the top of the core. And I did that for 2 reasons. The first reason is because it will seal any small imperfections. If there's any kind of a little ding or a dent or a scratch or whatever, it would seal that in, even though this gasket is 1/8 inch thick. But the other reason is it's slippery, and so it allows this gasket to slide a little bit as you're inserting every one of these bolts, so that you don't, again, get to one end and have the gasket being stretched or pulled. The gasket maker allows the gasket to kind of find its own place. I punched, these are 5/16 bolts, and I punched 5/16 holes in the gasket, and all the bolts went through with no problem. So put down a thin layer of the gasket maker. Then I put the gasket onto the header. Again, this is standing up, and I used a drift or a punch to center all the holes to get the gasket where it's supposed to be. I then put a thin layer on the tank end, on the copper face, and again, facing upways, I set this down on top of there, lined it up as best as possible, and then you just start to assemble this. So you have the tank ends, the frame ends rather, you have the thick bar that goes to the inside, you have the thin bar that goes to the outside, and you just go ahead and put all the bolts in. 5/16 bolts, I believe these are 1.25 inches long, and I used nylock nuts, no washers needed. You get all of the bolts put in and started. And then I used an electric impact and I started from the middle and worked my way out. So I did maybe 4 here, 4 here, another 3 each way here, another 3 each way here. So I'm moving from the middle out, so that if there's any expansion, it goes to the outside rather than from the ends in, which could cause a slight buckle on here. I use the electric impact just to get the bolts snug, since they were nylocks. Get all the bolts in snug. Then I use 2 hand wrenches and I work again from the middle out, alternating sides. And just by hand, you feel the tightness of the bolt. I don't know if there's a bolt spec, but you can just kind of feel it. And you know, as you go, you work your way along, some of the bolts get loose, and so you know it is kind of compressing. Not super tight, but just nice and snug. The other thing is, when you're doing that, what I did was I turned the bolt head and held the nut. And the reason that I did that was because the bolt goes through 5 layers of material. You have your inner frame, and then you have the header of the core right here. Then you have your gasket. Then you have the copper tank end, which is this, and then you have your next steel piece. So it's a 5-layer sandwich. Well, as the bolt goes through, it can catch an edge, catch a thread on any of those surfaces, most likely the thin ones. And so if you're pulling the bolt through with the nut, you might have, rather than overall compression, you might think that you're getting real tight on the nut, but you could be snagging on one of the thin pieces of metal. So by turning the bolt is actually threading itself into the nut. And that way, if it is snagged against one of these thin pieces, it also threads past that. That's the way I did it. So you work your way around. When you get to the ends here, this really compresses kind of a lot. So you'll do these 2 bolts and this one will be loose. You know, you'll do these 2 and the next one will be loose. But you just take your time. You go in slow increments, so you're doing everything nice and even. You don't want to be smashed on one side and forcing it on the other side. Everything is very flexible. But again, you just take your time. I probably went around it probably 4 times, snugging everything up. A little bit of, a little tough in here. These 2 bolts, I probably trimmed off about 1/8 of an inch to make sure that they weren't going to hit this connection tube. A little tight to get in there. Same thing on this side. The bottom one that's in bad shape, as you can see, I trimmed that guy maybe even a little short. But once I did one side, I flipped it upside down, so when I did this side, it was facing up. It makes it a lot easier to work with. And that's it. It's pretty intuitive. Again, start off with all new bolts, and you know, I just did a thin layer of the gasket maker, and then after sitting for 2 days, I filled it with water and let it sit, and no leaks at all, except for right there, which is the only place that it leaked before I took it out of the bus. It's you know, some of this JB weld. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to use this material and basically similar to a JB weld and give it a little smear. I got to let it dry. I just drained the water out of it, and that's it. If it were to weep right there, I would not be upset at all if that's the only place that it leaks in the system. So that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and paint this core. I think just because it's copper, you know, it will corrode. I can see some green on here already. So I'm just going to give it a spray bomb, and then the shroud goes on top of here. I cleaned out all of these threaded inserts. Some of them had broken bolts, some of them had crust in them. So those are all set. One of my hinge plates had a broken bolt, so I took that off, and when this was apart, and I got that broken stud out of there, so both hinge plates now have 4 bolts on them. There was a fair amount of corrosion down at the bottom, as you can see. I cleaned that up, all the scale. I sandblasted these parts to get them as flat as possible, any crust out of there. This core was about 1/4 of an inch thicker in this dimension, which was not a problem at all. As you can see, there's plenty of room in here for the thickness. There's plenty of clearance all the way around. The height has to be exact on your new core, absolutely exact, because these side frames have to fit tight up underneath your header. So, you know, but this was the size of the header was exactly the same as the tank, and then the height on it inside has to match this exactly. And that's it. So it was overall successful. I'm assuming I'm going to have much better cooling with the bigger, you know, more tubes, and also them being clean, and this being the new kind of fins and all that. So I'm considering this a win. I just put the shroud on and put it back in place. So hope it was informative and maybe helped somebody out on their project. And good luck if you have the opportunity to give it a go.